Hi, welcome back to Lightning GIS. This is Toby Dogweiler. We're going to talk about one of the most important topics in GIS today, and that is rasters. So this is an overview of rasters, what they are, how they work, sort of the basics. First, let's start. Here's some resource from the ESRI website that you can go to for further information, further reading about rasters. I've borrowed a lot of information from that particular web page for the discussion that we're going to have today on rasters. So let's get started. So what is a raster? In its simplest form, a raster consists of a matrix of cells or pixels organized into rows and columns. I like to think about this like the game Battleship, where you've got a grid that you're trying to guess where your opponent's ships are, and each cell has a label like B1 or A3. Now in a raster in GIS, we don't label them quite that way, but the idea is there. Each raster is sort of a square cell, and that cell can have a value. So that's why we get this idea of a grid. And so here what you see is a raster, and different values in the raster cells are colored different ways. And if you zoom in, you can see individual cells. So these cells are dark green, and that represents something, some value. And the blue is a different value, and the light green and the red. Those cell values can represent really anything we want them to. Temperature, elevation, wind patterns, soil types, just about anything you can imagine, you can put a value to it. Now, usually that value is numerical, so we come up with a code. Like if it's an elevation, it might just be the elevation in meters or feet as a number. But if it's a soil type, you might have 5 soil types you're interested in, and your raster may have values that are integers, 1 through 5. And then you have metadata that says 1 is soil type A and 2 is soil type B, and so forth. So when you talk about a digital elevation model or a DEM or an aerial photograph, satellite imagery, even pictures, or even a scanned map, so a map that's been scanned, those are all raster data sets. And every cell in those rasters has at least a value. And then it's important, all these things we're talking about are real-world phenomena. Rasters are great at presenting real-world phenomena. Real-world phenomena, like these things, temperatures and wind patterns and soil types, they're not just here and there. They're everywhere, right? There's a temperature for every spot on the Earth's surface, so we can create a raster with a cell size that works for our purposes and put the correct temperature in each one of those cells. And that way it represents the continuous area. All right, so why store data as a raster? It's a simple data structure. It's a matrix of cells. It's sort of easy to visualize in your head, and each cell has a value. Okay, it's kind of that simple, and that value is linked to an attribute table. It's a powerful format for advanced spatial and statistical analysis. We can use ArcMap to both symbolize those values and display them across the area, but we can also do raster algebra, or we can combine the information from different rasters and create new rasters derived from those original ones after we've manipulated them numerically within GIS. We've already talked about that rasters can represent continuous data and allow us to perform that surface analysis. It's also rasters, everything's uniform. Each cell's the same size. Each cell has a value that represents the phenomenon that we're mapping within that raster. So unlike point data, where your points can be randomly distributed and there could be different distances between them and so forth, in a raster, every data point is the same distance from all the data points around it. And we can do fast overlays and complex arithmetic pretty quickly with raster data sets too, as I mentioned, using the raster calculator. All right, so what does the raster then, what does the value represent for the raster? In many rasters, it represents a center point. So if you're talking about a DEM as a good example, where the value represents an elevation at the center of the cell. Now, a lot of USGS DEMs are 30 meters, so the cell is 30 meters by 30 meters. That's a pretty big area. And the elevation value, the value for that would be the elevation at the center. But the elevation out towards the edge of the cell could actually be different. All right, so you need to keep that in mind. Now, other rasters, the value applies to the whole cell. So it just depends on what phenomenon is being mapped, but you can see both of these ideas portrayed down here. Here's a DEM raster where the value represents the center of the cell, and you can sort of drape then a topographic surface over that to represent that. Or we could have a cell where the whole cell, that value represents that whole area. And that's sort of represented here in the columns that stick up graphically. All right, now raster resolution is defined by the cell dimension. So each cell has a height and a width. Almost always the height and the width will be equal. So if that height and width is 1 meter, that means each cell in the raster represents a 1 meter area on the actual Earth's surface. Your raster resolution would be 1 meter. Now, the raster resolution is important. A high resolution raster, like that 1 meter data set, has a lot of accuracy, maybe like this example on the left here, because it's a small area. Each area gets a value, and so you can accurately portray the phenomena. But it takes up a lot of data. You've got to have, if you're talking about a huge area like a county or a state, 1 meter, a 1 meter grid is a lot of cells within that grid. That's a lot of data to store, and then when you're processing and using those data in GIS, it's a lot of data to do computations on. So it'll take a lot of disk space, it'll take a lot of RAM, it'll take a lot of processing power to do the computations, it'll slow things down. Whereas a low resolution raster, maybe a 30 meter by 30 meter DEM, a lot less data, so it's easier to do computations, it's less disk space to store. But look at that same area, because things are being generalized, the shape of the area, which here would be the real world shape of the area, that's well reproduced by the high resolution raster, but poorly reproduced by the low resolution raster. So that's the downside of the pros and cons of raster resolution. Now, the extent of a raster is defined essentially by the bounding rectangle. So even if the raster set is not a perfect rectangle, and that can be the case if you clip it that way or something, the rectangular extent that completely contains all the raster data represents the extent. So here we have the red corners of the raster area. That northeast or the north-south coordinates, the north-south-east-west coordinates of each of those corners would define the extent of the raster, either as a bounding rectangle or for the full raster if the full raster is a rectangle. All right, now, I want to emphasize, because a lot of rasters are used for DEMs and hydrography, so hydrology data sets and elevation data sets, that there is a duality that joins these two things. Flowing water erodes the landscape. So the shape of the hills, the depth of the valleys, all of that is caused by the erosion due to water moving across the surface, usually water moving across the surface of that landscape. But also then that topography defines the watershed. So the watershed is the topographic basin that drains to a specific pour point. So that defines the drainage direction. So if you have a slope, water's going to flow down the slope. Water always flows downhill, and it will always flow down the steepest path along that slope. But that steepest path was eroded by water. So I don't know, you could get philosophical and it'd be a chicken and the egg thing, but you have to understand that they're intimately interconnected. Flowing water erodes the watershed, and then that eroded watershed determines the direction the flowing water is going to go. It's as deep as I'm going to get today. All right, so here's the topography defining a watershed. This is a blow-up of a 1 to 24,000 map, topographic map from Austin, Texas. You can see the watershed is the red area. The red boundary defines the watershed. The outlet is the point there in sort of the southeast corner. And then the drainage direction are these blue arrows, and the water always goes down the steepest path. So perpendicular to the contour lines is the way the water is going to flow in that watershed. That's an important concept to think about for hydrologic rasters, where we've got flow direction and flow accumulation, which we'll talk about in a different video. All right, so here I'm just showing you two different rasters for the Rush Pine Creek watershed in southeastern Minnesota. One up here shows elevations. So it's a DEM, and I've colored here. The highest areas I just left uncolored, so they show through as gray. The lowest areas are the dark green, and sort of the middle elevation band are the light greens. And then in the lower, I've mapped three different main vegetation types. So the dark green vegetation you see tends to correlate, I colored so that it would correlate, because there's a certain type of vegetation at those lower elevations. At the upper elevations, we tend to have, I've correlated those colors. So what you see here, by doing the colors the same, I've identified that, hey, you know, we have different vegetation growing at different elevations. So that's how rasters can help us, because we can take the DEM, which gives us the elevation. We can take land use that's saved as a raster. We can overlay those data sets, symbolize them in a way that sort of brings it all together to show us that there are bands. The vegetation has at least a little bit of dependence on the elevation that it's growing at. All right, so that's where we're going to end this lecture on rasters and an overview. I hope that gives you a better sense of what a raster is, and when you're working with them in GIS, a little bit of information. Remember back the first slide, I gave you some further reading for rasters. You can get into a lot more detail there. And thank you for joining me again for Lightning GIS. I'm Toby Dogweiler.